In my last lecture on ethics, when we started this sort of mini course, we talked about rights-based ethics and libertarianism. Now, libertarianism has certain drawbacks, and we're going to contrast that to utilitarianism or goal-based ethics today. And we are going to be talking about Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill's contributions to utilitarian ethics to see how it answers certain ethical problems. Now, we've talked about rights-based ethics before, and for rights-based ethics, the rightness or wrongness of a decision is based on what are the rights and are they being violated. In a goal-based ethical system, we have some goal, and the question is, are we reaching that goal or not? Now, it might strike you at first, this is kind of broad. We can have different goals, right? Well, we're going to see how utilitarians specifically want to start from a basic idea of what gives something value. Now, let's say we have a life that is being lived by someone, and they experience pleasureful experiences, and they also experience suffering. Now, you've got a rights-based approach, which is going to say that that life is inherently good because they are endowed with certain rights, and they don't have to earn these rights, they just have them. Utilitarians, on the other hand, are going to say, well, if we have pleasure and we have pain, what happens if we try to quantify these? To try to decide, okay, when we make some decision, how much pleasure is it going to give us and how much pain is it going to give us? So let's say we have a life that consists of 60% pleasure and 40% pain. A utilitarian would say that this is a good life because it exists or is constituted primarily by pleasure. Now, if this was the other way around, they would say, well, what right do we have to call this a good life if what is good for humans is pleasure and what is bad for them is pain? Now, you could just as well say, well, why are we treating pleasure as the good thing? Because utilitarians, kind of looking at ethics as a whole, they're going to say that we've got pleasure and pain, and pleasure is good and pain is bad. We might say, why is pleasure good and why is pain bad? And they're going to kind of hinge a little bit on Hobbes, who talks about humans acting in their self-interests. Hobbes says, that without a state, life would be nasty, brutish, and short, because everyone in the state of nature, without some sort of overarching structure of state morality telling them what they can or can't do, people are always going to try to take advantage of other people in order to try to reach their own ends. When we look at pleasure and pain, therefore, Hobbes is going to say that in the state of nature, we're always going to try to strive for pleasure and we're going to try to avoid pain. So Bentham is going to say, okay, then pleasure is good for us because that's what we are trying to achieve and that's what's going to make us happy. And pain is bad for the opposite reason. So if we are trying to come up with a decision and we're trying to decide if it is good or if it is bad, we want to know, how does it affect pleasure? How much pleasure is it going to bring about? Or how much pain is it going to bring about? If it is going to produce more pleasure than pain, then according to Jeremy Bentham, according to this pleasure principle, it's called, it's a good action. Now, this makes us think about, okay, let's say some action produces 50 units of pain or pleasure and 10 of pain. That, you know, we would try to quantify something and say this is going to produce quantitatively more pleasure than pain. The question is, what unit is this? Really, the only thing we can think of is maybe money. And we can say, okay, it is good to have lots of money and bad if we are losing money. And then we can think of this as like a cost-benefit analysis, and we can say, okay, if I make this decision, it's going to give me $50, and I'll probably maybe lose $10. And you would say this is a good thing because in the end you're gaining $40. So we can think about economic decisions like this, and we can do a cost and a benefit analysis and try to figure out, is this a good thing economically? And we can see how the utilitarian logic comes out in these kind of decisions, that we are trying to find some quantity of pleasure or some unit of pleasure that is going to teach us how we can try to look at things rationally and figure out what is good, not without or not by looking to some high in the sky rights, but by grounding it in something material. Because Bentham writes a essay called Anarchical Fallacies, and it's against the French Revolution, where they say, look, we've got these rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or it's not those words exactly, but it's something like that. And they mention these inalienable rights. And Bentham says maybe rights are not a good way to think about ethics, because he sees a rights-based ethics system as leading to anarchy. Now, what do we mean by that? Let's say I have a plot of land here. This is plot number 1. And there's a neighboring plot here, plot number 2. Now, having a rights-based ethics approach is nice, because plot number 1 has its property rights. Just like you have rights to personal property via lock, you have rights to land that you appropriate and use. Plot 2 also has its property rights. But Hobbes says that this is not very stable, because what's going to happen is all along this border, there's going to be fighting, and this border is going to tend to dissolve because both groups are trying to fight for their own interests. And ideally, it would be nice if this was all subsumed as land 1 and it's bigger now, or land 2 and it's bigger now. We're seeing kind of some imperialist kind of stuff. So Hobbes says, you know what we can do? Overarching this, we can have the state. And the state, because it is going to punish you if you don't follow the rules, is going to say that this line should be there. Now the problem is, the state is also going to have other laws about the land, such as, I don't know, you can't amass some kind of mass militia in like Waco, Texas with the Branch Davidians, where they amassed all these arms in this religious cult, and they're about to start a war, this is kind of considered an incitement to violence, and as such, you don't have the right to that. So all these rules are going to be imposed on each of these properties, and the person upon whom the laws are being imposed can just say, no, these are my property rights. You don't have any right to interfere with them at all. And if there's a competing claim, both of these people, I mean, we can think of, this might be funny, of North Korea and South Korea, and neither one of them is willing to claim the other's legitimacy. North Korea doesn't believe that South Korea is a legitimate political entity. They think they have the rights to the whole of the Korean peninsula, and the South thinks the same for the North. And both of these are trying to link their claim to Korea on rights, on ancient, cultural property rights of this is the Korean people and we're the true Korean people. But they're ultimately using a rights-based approach to try to say we have a right to this land and you don't. Bentham says, look, that's expected when you have inalienable property rights. If they're inalienable, they are naturally going to lead to anarchy because no one is going to be able to decide. And we could think of this as well with religious freedom. We've got Christians, Sikhs, Jews, heathens, ... And then down here, you've got the Aztecs. And all these groups have their own practices. The Christians have the sacraments. The heathens have these rituals they do where they drink from this gourd-like pipe, or pipe-like gourd kind of thing. And then you've got the Aztecs who commit human sacrifices by throwing people into volcanoes. And you say, everyone has the right to practice whatever religion they want, just like they have rights to free speech or whatever. But we certainly might not think of all these practices as equivalent. We'd be like, no, there is a line here between acceptable practices and non-acceptable. And what is the exception? Violence. It's an active part of the belief is these tributes to the gods where you throw people into volcanoes. I don't even exactly know the specific religious lore of the whole thing, but we can see that religious freedom or the right to a religion is not absolute. There's a line in the sand. In the same sense, freedom of speech is not absolute. Anyone who is a free speech absolutist is not thinking hard enough. We have, for example, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater because it's going to cause a panic. You don't have the right to freedom of speech if it's an active incitement to violence. We also have defamation laws, where if you make groundless claims that are going to insult someone's career and jeopardize their career as a public figure, and those claims turn to be unfounded, that's defamatory, and that is not free speech. Recently, there's also questions of hate speech. Is certain speech violent even if it's not an explicit call to violence? It's an interesting question. Where does speech where is it directly violent and we want to draw the line? And where is it kind of violent but not directly? And do we want to extend that line to account for that speech that could be damaging society? But free speech is not absolute. And Bentham's like, look, we know rights aren't absolute. They're going to lead to conflict like this. And as such, you don't have rights. They don't exist. He says that we try to derive these religious freedom rights or freedom of speech or freedom of the press or freedom to bodily autonomy or whatever it be, that we try to derive these from nature, but when we really think about it, we're really not saying anything much at all. He ultimately wants to prove that saying I have a right to something really doesn't mean anything if it's an inalienable right, because Hobbes says that in the state of nature, where there is no state, you have the right to do whatever you want. You can kill anyone, you can appropriate a tree and take its fruit, you can appropriate land for agriculture, you can start a cult, you can do whatever you want, because there's no laws in a state of nature. There's no laws yet. Once we enter into the state, however, we agree that certain things are natural rights that we don't want to be infringed upon. And what he means by natural rights is we've got our state of nature, and in it you can move freely, you can eat as you please, you can own property in a very loose sense, in the sense that you can live on something and claim that it's yours, and you can say what you want, and you can kill what you want. Now, something happens when we get into society, and we have the state. In the state, we've got lots of different people, and people will take advantage of this list of possibilities to do whatever they can to ensure their survival. But when we enter into this state formation, we say, okay, killing people is something you cannot do. You can't kill people because this is a right people have, a right to life. And we could add this to our list of things we can do. And this is probably one of the most important ones, is you have the right to life in the sense that you can do it in the state of nature. It's something you have by default. So when we say you can't kill, we say no because you're violating a natural right, because it's something you can do in nature. And we agree that in this state formation, we're going to start upholding those rights. Bentham thinks that if we look at the right to life and we want to call it a natural right, we're really not saying anything. We're saying that right equals ability. That because you can live, you ought to live. It's an appeal to nature. It's a fallacy. Bentham says when we say we have rights, really we're just saying there's something you can do, and we're going to say you have the right to do it. And he says when we do this, we bring certain qualities to the fore, certain abilities, and they are inevitably going to clash, because people are always going to be saying, oh, my rights are violated by the state having any kind of structure of ordinances for how I can build on my property, or for what I can say, or where I can go to school, or whatever it may be, or how I can use my money, like with taxes and stuff like that. Bentham says a rights-based approach is not only not saying anything, but it's taking things that people can just do and making it where they're going to conflict with one another. As a result, Bentham thinks, look, natural rights, these things, there are no natural rights. There are only legal rights. There are only rights when the government recognizes them. It's actually not too dissimilar from Hobbes, because Hobbes says we have these natural abilities, and when we have this overarching coercive power, is what he calls it, that is going to scare us into submission to the law, that then they become rights because they're respected by the coercive power that establishes them in their place. Now, Hobbes thinks they were kind of already rights because they were already things we can do. But Bentham thinks that doesn't make any sense to say they were already rights. He thinks rights don't make any sense without a law to say this is or this isn't a right. So as such, he says, when we have an action, all we should think about is how much pleasure will it result in and how much pain will it result in. And if it results in more pleasure than pain, it's a moral action. So let's take a look at a very famous idea. We have train tracks, and on the train tracks, we have 5 people on one train track and 1 person on the other. And we have a trolley car here, the T for the trolley car. And you're looking at the situation. The trolley car is barreling down the track towards 5 people. You have the option to pull a lever and divert the train onto the other track and kill 1 person. Let's do a Benthamite kind of cost-benefit analysis of this situation. If we do nothing, let's see, we've got nothing and we've got pull the lever. If we do nothing, and we're looking at overall human flourishing in this example, 5 people are going to die, and 1 person is going to be saved. So in the end, this results in 4 lives being lost in total. This is a negative outcome, and thus it is immoral. But if we pull the lever, 5 lives have not been ended, so 5 have been saved, and 1 has been lost. That is +4. So the utilitarian would say, we've saved 4 lives. Now, you've got someone like a rights-based person who might say, look, by putting yourself in this situation and pulling this lever, you are actively interfering in the rights of this 1 person. It doesn't matter that it results in 4 lives not being lost. It's still murder. And the utilitarian would say, no. It's not, or it is murder, but they would say murder isn't a bad thing unless it is resulting in net human harm. So if we look at this situation and we want to say it's murder, the utilitarian would say we're only looking at this 1 person and we're failing to see the bigger picture. They would say that if we look at it on the whole, if we're looking at just the 1 person, we're seeing murder. But if we look at the whole situation, it's a sacrifice for the common good. We are choosing a necessary evil of murder But in the context of the larger decision, the utilitarian would say this is justified because the murder has been outweighed by the fact that we have saved a lot of lives. Think of this like it's 9/11. It's the morning and one of the plane hijackers has just passed TSA, or I guess there was no TSA then, duh. They're getting ready to get on the plane and they go to the bathroom. You know that in the future, they're going to hijack a plane and drive it into one of the Twin Towers and result in, 1,000 people being killed or something like that? Hundreds of people being killed. And you have a knife and you're in the bathroom too. You have the option to stab them and kill them or let them go. Now a rights-based utilitarian, or not, a rights-based libertarian might say, our idea of ethics should be structured around maximizing human freedom. Even if that results in negative consequences, like letting a predatory business practice pass that is going to maybe deprive a large population of water for the purposes of a small minority of people. The rights-based libertarian is going to say that if we tried to stop that practice, we'd be interfering with the freedom of the individual making that decision. In the same sense, here in the 9/11 example with the hijacker, they might say that you're directly ending someone's life. And whether or not that person goes on to end hundreds of other people's lives, that's up to them. And they should have the choice to do that. And we should punish them if we find out. But they would say that we should not interfere and kill them because that might be a violation of their rights. Now the utilitarian would say this is silly. We know they're going to kill hundreds of people and it's going to end in a net human suffering of hundreds of people. Compare that to the one life that would be ended. You'd in effect be saving like 1,000 people. So the utilitarian thinks this is a no-brainer. Now, we get a basic sense for how this works with the trolley problem of calculating human flourishing or suffering. But this has its limits because in reality, no one is just a straight up rights-based ethics thinker or just a straight up utilitarian or just a straight up duty-based ethics or virtue-based ethics thinker. Let's say I have a town and this town has lots of people inside it. And in this hypothetical example, this town can become the perfect town. There will be no suffering of any kind. It will be blissful and perfect and everyone will tolerate one another and just it will be perfect in every way. Let's just ignore whether or not that's even a possibility. You could do that, but the one condition is you have a box with a person inside it. And this one person is going to be violently tortured all of their life. I mean, they're going to be stabbed and, their eyes are going to be gouged out. They're going to be waterboarded as much as they possibly can for the rest of their life. They're going to suffer for a long time. Let's say it's a baby. And this baby is going to suffer just enough where it can still grow. And it is going to suffer. And let's even say it's an immortal baby. And it's going to live forever. And this society is going to be great forever. But this baby is going to be tortured forever. The kind of Benthamite utilitarian is going to say, look, we've got, I don't know, let's say this town has, I don't know, 4 million people in it. I don't even know if a town has that population, maybe like New Delhi or something. Let's say this town has 4 million people in it, and this is just one baby. They might say, look, as uncomfortable as this makes us, we have to get past this narrow-minded understanding of human rights and realize that the rights of this baby are no more valuable than the 4 million rights. They would say this is like a 4 million to 1 situation, and there are 4 million rights here and there's 1 right here. So in a sense, this situation is 4 million times more important than the baby. And the libertarian would say that no, any rights ever being violated, and maybe within a certain margin of error in order to maintain peaceful coexistence, that no, this one is just as valuable as these 4 million. And the utilitarian is going to say, no, 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 you have to look at the bigger picture. As uncomfortable as this is, and all the horrible stuff that's going to be done to them, I mean, there are things I could say, but I'm not going to say so that the video doesn't get taken down or something. But, I mean, imagine the worst possible experience for this 5-month-old baby for infinity. You'd be lying if you said that didn't make you at least a little uncomfortable. In a more real world example, let's say that you're a political leader and you believe you have the means to create the perfect society and make it blissful for everyone. You have the financial means and the military means and all this to create a society, but it's going to require killing 6 million Jews, as well as a number of disabled people. And, you know, let's say that you have these ends in mind. Using the utilitarian logic, you could say that this society that I create, it should be obvious by now I'm talking about Hitler, the Nazis, that the amount of prosperousness that is going to come from this society justifies a Holocaust. So, very quickly, utilitarianism knows no bounds. And you might say, well, human action has no bounds. We have to create something that is going to be consistent. And even if it makes us uncomfortable, it ultimately will lead to the most perfect society. And you might think, as a rebuttal, well, what kind of value does that perfect society have if it required killing 6 million innocent people? And that is where John Stuart Mill comes on the scene. Now, John Stuart Mill writes this real famous essay called On Liberty. It's kind of long, it's almost like a book, and I'm not even really sure what you would call it. But in On Liberty, he wants to try to put together human rights with utilitarianism. And he says, look, there is room for an understanding of rights within utilitarianism. Mill says, okay, rights don't objectively exist out there. It's not like we just one day like reach up into the sky and we're like, oh yeah, I have a right to property. No. Just like Bentham said, they're something that's a function of government, something that's a function of a society agreeing upon them together, kind of like a social contract kind of thing. And that they don't exist outside of this social contract. It's not like they were out there waiting to be recognized, but that the contract is the rights. It's not the codifying of the rights that were already there, but in fact, the governmental structure that is recognizing them is the very exigence of the rights. So Mill says, look, we know that we can't objectively derive these rights, but maybe we can combine libertarianism, which is appealing because it appeals to the liberty of the individual. And John Stuart Mill is in Britain and trying to work through, the state seems to have these lines that it wants to cross, and we have to have some limit somewhere. So it's not like the state just has the liberty to do whatever they want. So we like the idea that there's a fail-safe of rights that are going to put a limit on things. But we also have utilitarianism, which is appealing because it's a little bit more solid, kind of analytically speaking, than libertarianism, because we can do a process where we can try to quantify how much pleasure or pain is going to result from some incident, and we can decide whether or not it's good. And Mill says the way we can combine these is utility. What if we try to ground our decisions not only in the utility with regards to pleasure or pain of humans, but we try to ground human liberty in a sense of utility? Mill says, okay, what if we have a society where, and he doesn't talk about the baby in the box, but let's use the baby in the box example that's being tortured. We could say, okay, it's going to result in 4 million people being in pure bliss and 1 person being in pure agony. It's justified. Mill is not so quick, because he says, look, if we are in a kind of society where we could do that, would people really be able to live in a blissful society if they knew that there was a baby being tortured there? And this is kind of where the analogy breaks down, because we kind of had to assume that the society could be perfect, and you were just looking at it from the outside and you knew that that baby was suffering. But if that suffering of the baby is in the societal consciousness, it's hard to see how that would really be a society people could live in, because no one feels any value for their lives. If it serves society at large, they could end up in that box too, just like the baby. So Mill says, look, maybe rights, human liberty, is a function of utility too. That if it's useful to society, that certain rights, like, I don't know, the right to life, if those are abandoned, maybe, even if this means, say, we kill the baby in the box, the question is, if that right to life is so instrumental that it's completely unimportant, it's unclear if this utility actually matters, considering that it would also degrade society as a whole, in the sense that there would be no valued foundation to people's lives outside of utility. And Mill says, okay, rights don't actually exist. But what if we pretended like they exist if it was beneficial for society to do so? And he comes up with these principles that he says are going to lead to greater human pleasure and less human suffering by grounding these rights in that balance of pleasure and suffering. That if we have these things, we'll live in a better society. And we're grounding this not in some high in the sky principle, they're just already there, but it's a function of utility. So even though it's instrumental rights, he thinks that maybe it's a useful way to derive them. And he says, okay, we have freedom of speech. we can talk to whoever we want, and we can also assemble and exchange ideas however we want, because that's going to lead to a society of solidarity and civil understanding or civic understanding, and it's going to lead to greater human flourishing. And then also we have the ability to act as one pleases, provided that they don't infringe upon other people's right to act as they please, unless it is going to negatively affect human flourishing. So this is not too dissimilar from the libertarian principle, that maybe the ability to act as one pleases is actually a useful one because it grounds acts in the pleasure and pain principle, that liberty is a function of whether or not it's going to lead to a greater society. So here Mill tries to bridge the gap and say that human liberty is something we should agree upon because it's useful. Maybe that might make you a little dissatisfied, like, oh, we're just like, these rights aren't something deeper. But both Mill and Bentham are like, look, they're not just out there. That wouldn't even make any sense. We have to have some kind of structure which makes us agree upon them, kind of like Hobbes thought the overarching coercive power does. And as a result, he thinks that maybe we can ground it in utility, but we can't just ground it irrespective of the goals that it serves. Now, there's a big drawback to utilitarianism that really for me is almost more significant than the fact that it doesn't necessarily respect kind of our ideas of human rights, is the problem of the common currency of value. So, utilitarianism says that we ground our decisions in an idea of a goal. And in order to have a goal, we have to value particular ends. And this is also kind of where typically utilitarianism is thought of as maximizing human pleasure and minimizing human suffering. But a lot of modern thinkers, like Peter Singer, for example, who's a big kind of animal ethics guy, is like, why does it have to be human pleasure or pain that we're trying to utilitarianize? Why can't it be broader than that? So the question of the ends of what we value, because really here we've got, what do we value? Do we value humans, pigs, trees? Where do we draw the line? And we've also got the problem of how do we quantify it? And this is the problem of the common currency of value. We talked earlier about how we can try to use money, but the problem is not everything is a monetary procedure. Ford made a car called the Ford Pinto, and the Ford Pinto had a problem that Ford knew about. In certain situations of collision with another car, the gas tank wasn't very stable, and if hit in a weird way, the gas tank would dislodge and the whole car would explode. and it was a surety that the person inside would die. Now, Ford knew that for a very small sum, I think it was like $11 or something, they could apply a brace to the fuel tank of the Ford Pinto that would keep that problem from occurring. But, and this is kind of a symptom of kind of capitalism writ large, it is implicitly utilitarianism, because everything is put in terms of monetary gain or loss, of cost-benefit analysis. Is this going to be beneficial monetarily speaking for me? It doesn't matter if it's moral, because in a sense, moral is a high-in-the-sky idea for the market. The market doesn't function based off of morality, it functions based off of profit. And profit is the goal or the end that is being valued. So Ford questioned, is this going to be a worthwhile investment to have millions of Ford Pintos and spend an extra $11 on each one of them, which is going to rack up, admittedly, pretty fast. If you've got 1 million vehicles and you're spending $11 extra, you've just added an extra $11 million that you're paying. And the question is, well, how often is this collision going to occur? And what are the negative consequences of the collision? So Ford said, okay, we've got an $11 investment and we have, I don't know, 1 million vehicles. Let's kind of section this off. They said, okay, we expect that roughly 300 instances will come when the Ford Pinto will be hit in such a way based off of all these statistics about how often do accidents occur, how often would a collision from this angle or this gradient of angles that would result in this problem, how likely would that be to occur? And they said, okay, it'd probably be about 300. So we have about 300 guaranteed deaths. And they said, okay, if we try to quantify this situation into a utilitarian position, this is our cost. How much is it going to cost the company to do this decision? Now we want to also know, what is the potential outcome? Is it going to be lesser or greater than the cost? If the outcome is going to be less than the cost, then maybe they would choose the outcome instead. The outcome being the people who are going to die, because maybe it's more expensive to incur this cost than to incur the outcome, which would be cheaper. So they said, okay, given that there's about 300 accidents that are going to happen, there's going to be about 300 deaths. So 300 deaths, and they looked at the only thing a company can, money. And they said, okay, let's try to put a price on how much a human life is worth. Let's factor in funeral proceedings and compensation to the victims' families and some sort of estimated impact they'll have on society, maybe through the average salary of the worker to see how much that would impact the market. They'll look at all these different factors, and maybe they might even try to factor how much is a life just inherently worth regardless of their market functions. But it's doubtful whether that would even be considered. They figured out that the outcome was going to be less. That if they willingly let these 300 people die, the company Ford could pay for all these human lives, and it would be less than the 11 million or whatever it is that it would cost to ameliorate the issue. So Ford used a utilitarian mindset to sacrifice 300 people. And in fact, it wasn't 300 people. It was closer to 500. So, and it might even still have been the case that 500 would be an outcome they're willing to incur, because it would be against their interest to willingly protect 300 people, because it would incur a loss on the company. So we can see a problem. Not only is there a general lack of regard for any sort of inherent value in human life, but the question is right here. We use money to try to talk about how much a human life is worth. What else could we even use? If we're trying to quantify the value of a human life, we don't exactly have a lot of metrics that we can use to quantify value. Typically, when I say, oh, what is this pen or this marker worth? Or how much is it valued? Well, I could say, oh, by the market, it's valued $1. But if I wanted to say any other kind of value, like maybe the value to me, I could say, maybe I could say it's valued a lot, because that's specific. I could say, I've used this in a lot of my lectures, and it's been with me in my dorm room through a lot of different readings that's changed my life. And I can say that as such, as a lot of sentimental value. But sentimental value is an empty term. We can't really quantify sentimental value outside of saying it's priceless. You might say this about a family heirloom. But saying it's priceless is, in effect, saying its value cannot be quantified. And maybe you might say this about humans. Maybe you might say that our value is unquantifiable. I mean, we can try to put it into monetary terms, but ultimately we can only connect these monetary terms in terms of the value of human life with other monetary things. How does it impact the happiness of the family? But we can only talk about that in terms of how is it negatively going to impact their capacity for labor, and thus decrease their productivity at their job, and thus incur a negative cost on the company that they work for? Or how is it going to affect their spending habits? Or how is it going to affect the loss of a job that has been incurred by the person that has died? Ultimately, whenever we enter into trying to quantify human value in something, we can only talk about that value in reference to other values. So in terms of monetary terms, we're just stuck in the market for human value. And most people don't think that human value is only in the market alone. So the problem is, can we put a price on human life? And even if we think, I don't necessarily have a problem with trying to put a price on human life. Some people think that just to even try to do that is to disgrace the human because they're priceless. I don't see that as much of a problem as I do even trying to quantify human life. Because if we say use monetary terms, it seems uncontroversial to say that that person has a value outside of their influence on the market. They have the value that they've instilled through the memories in their parents, which can't be quantified in a monetary means because there's nothing monetary, that there's no dollar value of a memory. It would be strange to talk about. Maybe I'd be amenable to argument, but it seems that in trying to determine the ends to achieve, namely, what are we valuing, but also how do we value it, that this how is completely unclear. So as such, utilitarianism has a great problem with quantifying cost and benefits, because the value or meaning of an event and how it's going to impact human suffering or human pleasure is variable. For example, the baby in the box. Maybe for some people that doesn't really affect them, but maybe for others, it's a great loss to society as a whole that we've stooped so low or whatever. So utilitarianism struggles with the fact that while it appears to be very computational, it is computational within a very limited range of possible quantification, and outside of that, it's unclear how useful it really is in trying to get down to morality as such. Now, if that is even a thing, is a topic for another video. But I hope this has given you something to think about in terms of ethics in general, and some thoughts on Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And that's about it for this lecture. Comment if you have any questions, and I'll see you in another one.